Okay, then let me talk briefly about feeding. So I feed sugar syrup after all the honey is taken off the hives, and I think I need to address like why I do that and why it works here. So here in southern Ontario, the rest probably the same goes for the northern US and all across Canada. We have very distinct seasons. So in the summer, lots of brood production, lots of honey production. In the winter, absolutely nothing. And so to be clear, within the brood chambers, our queens shut down and totally stop laying any eggs, so there's no brood production from, maybe mid-October. Things are totally hatched out and finished, maybe a little bit later, a little earlier, depending on where you are, through November, December, January, maybe into February. The queen will resume laying here as the days start to get a bit longer, and then through March and April is when they really start to expand the population of the hive again. So because we have no brood production at all for like 4 months of the year, we can actually take up all that space in the single brood chamber with feed. So that's what feeding is to me. As we get into the fall and queens really shut down their brood production, we feed them with sugar syrup so that there's no empty space in that hive. A lot of years what would happen is the queen will stop laying, brood hatches out, and then there's no forage, there's no resources for them. So even if they have honey stored up above in more brood chambers, you would still be left with the empty space that the brood had formerly taken up. So we like to make sure that they get sugar syrup to take up all that empty space. And so obviously if you live in like the southern United States or other parts of the world where your queens are active and actually laying eggs year round, it's a totally different management scheme. So I can't even comment on how you would do that, but obviously you'd be feeding differently at different times of the year than the way I do it. So I'm just commenting on what I do and what we know works here. And I'll show you quickly here another reason why I like to feed sugar syrup instead of only letting them rely on their own honey stores. This is honey that I'm extracting as I pull off the hives, and if you can notice on this frame here, all up in the top, that's honey, but it's rock hard. It's crystallized, nearly solid in these frames, and that actually happens with some of the honey. With some of the honey we collect around here, is more prone to crystallization than others. So this is likely from the summer. We have a lot of canola that is farmed around here, and so canola honey is known to crystallize really quickly and can happen right on the hives. So we try and take it off earlier than I did in this case. Crystallization in the comb can also happen with a lot of our fall honeys. So if you're just relying on the bees foraging for their own resources and bringing it back to the hive, I see this crystallized honey as a bit of a risk. It's probably not the end of the world, but in some cases, our winter clusters of bees are really not active much at all. They're clustered very tight together, and they need to have liquid feed under them. If it's crystallized and solid, often in the winter they can't access it, and crystallized honey doesn't do them a lot of benefit over the winter. So I see this as a slight risk that, in my opinion, it's better just to mitigate or try and eliminate as many risks as possible. And when we feed high quality sucrose syrup, it doesn't crystallize in the comb like that, and it's very easy for them to digest. I think some of the, particularly asters, which we have a lot of this time of year, the purple asters really start to bloom, and a lot of the honey that they bring in off of that has a lot of like indigestible content in it. Certain like resins come in with that nectar, and it can give them sort of dysentery problems over the winter if they were to have too much of that at once. So for all those reasons, sugar syrup is a safe, reliable source of feed that gets them through the winter really well. So I try to feed that now. So you can see here in this bee yard I've got a couple of 45-gallon drums, and these are filled with sugar syrup right now. I'm not really ready to open one at the moment, but when I am, what you could do to feed is simply open the lid and put a thick layer of straw in there, like a good solid 5 to 6 inches thick of straw, and dunk it in that. It'll float to the top, and so bees can land on that and not drown, and they can take the syrup back to their colonies right here. And it'll happen very quickly. You can see a lot of these colonies are sort of hanging out the front now that I have taken all the boxes off the top, and that's okay. Partly because it's really warm out, but also their populations are bigger now than they're going to be in just a month or so when we're really getting into the later fall. So their populations will naturally decrease, and it really won't be an issue for the winter. And you can do this sort of open feeding on a smaller scale too, just with like 5-gallon buckets in your bee yard. So if you're feeding, approximately close to 4 gallons per colony, just measure that out appropriately, and the bees will take that down very quickly. I'm fortunate to not have very many other beekeepers at all in the area that I keep bees. I know that's a big concern for people who open feed because they don't want to be feeding someone else's bees or something like that. The other thing you'll notice, this location I don't have an electric fence up. Most of my locations I have an electric fence for bears. Where you know you have bears, like a lot of my locations, I know there are bears frequently. Just put whatever you're feeding inside the bear fence. And honestly, one of these barrels by a yard like this will be taken down in a matter of 2 or 3 days. So it's not a risk for very long, at least. The other thing that I'm trying to do more of is pail feeding. So I've actually made some of these pails myself. I've cut drilled holes in the lid, and then I've actually melted. I bought these screens just at my local bee supply store here, so I'm not sure if they're carried everywhere, but I was able to find them through a beekeeping supply store. And I've melted the screen into this lid, but my holes are drilled. Let me show you. I've drilled holes through the lid that you can see here, and then I've melted the screen on permanently. And this is, you fill the pail with sugar syrup and invert it over top of your colony. So typically you'd have an inner cover with a hole in the center of it that you can sit on, and that sits right above your cluster of bees that can come up and get sugar syrup from here. It's a bit slower than barrel feeding, but then your bees don't have to come out of the hive, go to the barrel, and bring the syrup back. They can actually just be fed one by one within each hive, so each hive gets exactly as much as it needs to. In a single brood chamber, once you've fed them like 4 gallons of sugar syrup, that single box is going to weigh like 80 pounds or more, right? And that's plenty of stores to get them through the winter. So some of that comes down to management, a lot of it comes down to breeding as well, and a lot of it comes down to our environment. We just live in an environment here, we keep bees where that's possible. Our bees are very quiet through the winter time, not very active at all, and they go through very little food stores. So I think feeding bees in the fall is just, for us anyway, where we are, as the queens start to shut down, is just a balance of timing between how much brood is left in your colonies and when can you get that feed into them. So let me show you a picture of a frame I took, I think it was about 3 weeks ago. This would have been the last week of August. I took a picture of these frames, and so like nice big full frames of brood, which is pretty typical until late in the summer. And then I'll show you this other clip of frames of brood that I just took this week as I was taking off honey supers, so the middle of September now, or the second week of September, and they're already, as brood hatches out, the queen really isn't laying back into that space, and they're filling that space up with fall forage. It just so happens that this year there's a really good honey flow on now, but I have to take off honey boxes in order to treat for mites, so that's why I'm not collecting any more honey. So they're going to fill up their brood chambers a little bit with the fall forage. I know the way that I keep bees and a lot of beekeepers here keep bees is not for everyone. It totally depends on where you're located, and a little bit of it depends on the breeding of your bees too. Like I said, we've been working hard here in the province. I know beekeepers have been breeding bees specifically for overwintering in single brood chambers for decades now. So that's definitely playing into a part of why this works so well for so many beekeepers here. If it interests you, I just encourage you to give it a shot. If you enjoy keeping your bees the way you already do, then don't let me try and stop you. Do what works for you. I think beekeeping is all about experimenting with different things and figuring out what's best for your bees and what's best for you as a beekeeper and how you like to manage stuff. So I just encourage you to get into your bees as often as possible. So thanks again. We'll see you in the next one.